So hopefully we've got a title screen up.
You're looking good.
All right, cool. All right, thank you everyone for being here. This evening, we're going to talk about the traffic system in the amateur radio service, and a topic that's started to get a lot of attention is this business of having to move ICS forms 213, the general message form. And I've got some things I'll be basically tying some pieces together. Now, I've done a presentation about this, actually a series of them, at the ARRL National Convention in Florida earlier this year. I've got several training videos about this up on my YouTube channel. So I'm gonna do some real quick, just set everybody's sort of baseline understanding of what the pieces are. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to make them work, and then hopefully have some opportunity for some discussion toward the end of it. So thanks very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matthew Curtin, KD8TTE. In amateur radio, I'm a member of the ARRL. I've had a bunch of appointments formerly. I was an assistant section emergency coordinator. I was an emergency coordinator, an assistant emergency coordinator. I was a net manager for an NTS net. I'm active on various bits of those services. I've also done work with Radio Relay International. I'm the trustee of the station for RRI. I also have a YouTube channel where I do training focused on emergency communication, but not totally exclusively to that. I'm a fan of the Rat Pack. I think everything that's going on here is great stuff. I'm delighted to see this kind of discussion and helping to share what we know. I also am a warrant officer in the Ohio Military Reserve. I'm in the Signal Section headquarters. And so that basically means that my job is to deal with military and also civilian emergency management, disaster communications. So I spent a lot of time dealing with things like HF circuits and mostly like statewide and regional wide kind of stuff. I am the director of the Black Swan Communications Exercise. We talked about that at the Rat Pack a couple of months ago. And my day job is I run a firm that does cybersecurity forensic data analysis, and my focus areas includes things like cryptography and electronic messaging and networking and all that kind of good stuff. So that's sort of useful just to understand like what my perspective is and where I'm approaching this. The big thing I want for everybody to take away from this is an understanding of how and when to use the traffic system. And it's not just the matter of I got to send a birthday greeting. If we're talking about an emergency communication need, is the traffic system a good option for you? Well, when is it a good option? So I want to focus on addressing that question from a couple of different angles. First, I want to focus on what problem we are solving. Second is what resources we have that already exist. And then some fundamental concepts about what we are doing in radio messaging to focus on the business of presentation format versus relay format. Understanding these are not the same thing necessarily. And then where do we go from here now, understanding some fundamentals? So, the problem that we are trying to solve is one that is, the disaster scenario, or the normal communication circuits are overloaded, they're unreliable, whatever that situation is. When you've got a team, that deploys, you get your, go box or whatever, and you're out there on a thing and you need to talk to an EOC, that's a pretty straightforward kind of scenario. That's what a lot of our ARES groups do locally. And in a lot of cases, they actually do this with VHF. It might be NVIS kind of stuff, but for the most part, when a local ARES team is working, they're thinking about VHF to the local EOC. Now, if we're dealing with a scenario where we have mass casualty, multi-site, a big disaster, that kind of thing, we look at this picture that we have. There's the site station. We've got a couple of operators there, the site's incident commander, and this one line that's going off to some other site like the EOC. Things get a lot more complicated when you have a scenario where you've got not just the one thing happening, but lots of things, and they all need to be able to interoperate. If they don't have the ability to interoperate, then it becomes a much more difficult problem to manage, because the communication simply cannot flow the way that would be natural. So if you think about in the kind of scenario that we're discussing, a disaster, for example, we've got several people, groups of people that need to have some capability for communication. A lot of times we're talking about agencies and thinking about EMAs. We might be thinking about other kinds of NGOs, disaster relief organizations. They'll often have their own teams of that are able to operate an amateur spectrum if necessary, but also there'll be like, hospitals and that kind of thing. But sometimes we forget the individuals who are at some temporary shelter also have a need for communication. It doesn't follow that we have to choose which of these groups has the ability to communicate. These systems are all supposed to be able to provide infrastructure, and so that whoever the users are, if we understand how to make those pieces work properly, messages will go over the correct circuits, they will be put in the correct precedence, and it is possible for us to manage communication for all of those different groups and to do so effectively. So there isn't going to be a single net that everybody reports into, and now we've got net control trying to manage 176 stations in there, and one person wants to transmit a message, so everybody's sitting around waiting for the transmission. It's a system that we're talking about that needs to work, not just a net. And so it also means that we've got different needs for how information is going to get presented to people. And when you're talking again about an agency, they might have an expectation that things are going to be presented in the form of an ICS 213. They want to be able to originate. They want to create a message in the form of an ICS 213, and they expect that somebody on the other side is going to see just what it is that was created as an ICS 213. So that's the problem, how we're going to manage that. And before we go into this, let's, what resources exist? How can we actually make this sort of thing work? Well, I'll caution everybody here. I mean, I think that the more than most, I think the Rat Pack probably has a good understanding of the kinds of problems that we're going to run into really quickly. The balkanization that happens inside of amateur radio. I've described this a couple of times about, what's amateur radio like in terms of how a lot of the various things work. Well, just imagine a bunch of old engineers with the social skills of 14-year-old girls and put them all together and expect something to happen. Cohesion and teamwork is not usually the first thing that happens when you throw everybody into a scenario, right? So a big part of what we have to do here, and this is stressed, of course, in the DHS Auxcom course, is you got to check your logos at the door. We're not saying not to be in Aries or not to be in NTS or not to be in whatever, but you got to check all of that stuff because there's a mission to do right now. And we have to focus on what that is, and not so much about, well, I'm trained to do this or that or the other thing, and I've got, this set of patches to go along with it. It's really about, all right, who's our user? Who needs to have this service performed, and what service is that going to be like? So once we have sort of taken that on as a mindset that we're not going to be attached to, I'm an Aries operator or whatever, we can start looking broadly. What a lot of people, even within the ARRL, often don't understand is something like, well, Aries is a program for emergency communication, NTS is a program for birthday greetings, and not understanding what those things actually are. When we get out of that kind of linear thinking, and we can start to see what these different pieces are and what those resources are and how they can complement, how they are supposed to complement one another, we suddenly realize that we have a lot more options for things. We have a lot more solutions than we necessarily realized. So Aries, there is, of course, the Aries handbook that describes a lot of stuff. There's the field resource manual that's very helpful for when you're operating in a field condition. But do those operators also understand that if I've got to talk to somebody who's not on my net, I can create a message, I can move a message around anywhere else, and NTS is a way that I can do that. The traffic system is in place for the purpose of moving messages. You start looking at things like the way that agencies are often looking at things now, and start getting into CISA and the things like where they're putting forward the Oxcom program and the auxiliary communicator function, and how that relates to how we might be organized to provide some service to an agency. So there are resources. They have different logos and brands and things on them, yet they are all trying to address different kinds of issues. It doesn't mean that we have to choose one or the other. The issue is, how do we use these resources, make them work together so that we can actually solve the problem at hand? So I present this sometimes it is an oversimplification, but it's a useful oversimplification for the purpose of our present discussion. When we're talking about ARES, the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, this is basically a program. I think of it as kind of a loose association of local clubs. They have an interest in public service communication. They have relationships with organizations that might have a need for resilient communications, to have options in the event that all of the normal stuff fails. And at the same time, they are very, very locally focused. There's not a whole lot that you have in terms of command and control. You're not going to be able at a high level to be able to direct a whole bunch of things to happen and all the troops just get in line. So the focus there is very much about gear. It's about being able to set the station up. You've got a cool go kit. You can put an antenna up and the station is up and running in 7 minutes and you're awesome. Like, that's the kind of stuff that really we take a lot of pride in ARES. Now, the National Traffic System is a short message relay service. And so its infrastructure, it is a system of scheduled nets, frequencies, and the stations that use them for the purpose of relaying messages. It works within amateur radio. That's what the whole thing is about. But it does also have the ability to gateway to other systems. We've had examples of this that go back 50 years, where Mars messages needed to get back from infantrymen overseas, and you could have that kind of stuff gateway into NTS and vice versa. Also in shares, we have the ability to get messages between the two. We have gateway stations that can perform that function. Oxcom is an agency program. So that's where we're talking about an agency needs to qualify and to manage volunteers. Each of those volunteers has a relationship directly with the agency, and the way that they're going to organize that is typically going to be structured the way that we're talking about Oxcom. So where you've got races operations, for example, that's typically going to be Oxcom, but it can also use other radio services. An Oxcom team in an agency might well use shares or some other radio services in addition to amateur radio. So it's an oversimplification to talk about ARES, NTS, and Oxcom in these terms, but it's a useful oversimplification for the purpose of seeing what their focus areas are and how they relate to one another. So I want to walk through something very quickly that I have discussed in some of my other videos and some of the other presentations. So if you've seen them, you won't. Hopefully, I'll get to the next point before you fall asleep. The issue that we have with how we can get messages out and how to communicate broadly comes up a lot. I've been amazed to hear things like district emergency coordinators say that they would love to be able to get a message to everybody in their district by radio. If you can't do that, then what are we doing here? I mean, that's if we propose to be able to communicate in an emergency, yet we don't have the ability even to message our own stations, that's a problem. And To a large degree, it happens because people will often think about, oh, well, I'm not on that net. And that's where we need to get past this idea of being on the net and talking directly to one another. Not everything has to be a live phone call. A message works very effectively. That's why we have email. That's why we have faxes. There's a lot of things that will work and will work very well. In fact, will often work better simply because we have a record that we can refer to. So the concept that I'm proposing here is how to address that kind of a problem. How can we get a message that is going to be from some broad area, like the section level, for example, down to to a large number of people? You don't have to have everybody in one net across the state. In fact, you don't want to. That's going to be unwieldy. It's not really possible to manage things that way. The state of Ohio, as an example, that is the Ohio section. We have one section, it covers the entire state, and the state is made up of 10 districts. Each of the districts will have 8 to 11, 12 counties in it. And if you've got a message from the section, or let's say from an agency that's a state agency, and you want to get some information out to everybody in there, you don't have to go to each of the 88 counties. You would think, oh, that's a big savings of going to each of the operators. Well, of course, but you don't even have to go to each of the counties. You can have the message, you can originate it, you can have it transmitted to each of the districts. That means that you've got only 10. And now each of those districts has a representative at the section. They're able to pick up the message. They now have it in their district, which allows them in turn either to act upon it, or if it's something that's directly to the operators in the counties, they can simply relay it. That representative of the district to the section now has the message, and that representative can now enter the district net and transmit to all of the peers that are there in the district, at which point each county will now have the message. Inside of the county, then, they can do whatever they need to do with it, which might mean that it goes to a particular person, the EC, for example, or it might go to a net manager, or it might go to every station that is in the program for that county. The same process can be used to send things back up, and that is how we can move a large amount of information without effectively, because we're able to parallelize a lot of this kind of thing. We can have more than one message being transmitted at a time. And so that is a model that I did not invent. The ARRL has put this in the documentation. If we actually read about how ARES is structured, if we see how message relay nets are to be structured, this stuff has been documented, and it has been so for decades. Nevertheless, a lot of people are not used to it. We actually introduced a project in the year 2020, the County Information Report Project, where we would have a weekly piece of information, a task that would go to each emergency coordinator in the Ohio section, not by being transmitted directly, but it would be by radio message. And it would be, tell us a local landmark. And that would be the thing for the week. Then they would have to go, some ground truth information, something that somebody there would know and not have to do a lot of work, put that into a radio message, relay it back up. And we collected that sort of thing over a period of several weeks. And that was very helpful in just getting people used to the concept. So the structure is one that is already there and is very helpful. When we're talking about how to make that work, we often think in terms of, oh, it's a radiogram form, and we get very focused on that. But before we start talking about those kinds of issues, I want to talk a little bit about some foundational principles that we have here. When we're talking about messaging, there are three distinct steps to messaging. There is origination, relay, and delivery. very often when we are in the traffic system and when we're on traffic nets, there's the focus of the on-air activity, which is almost always relay. And the origination and delivery are extremely important steps. In fact, if you do origination poorly, it doesn't matter if you do relay well. If you do delivery poorly, it doesn't matter if you do relay well. It's and those are steps that are very badly undertrained. So, a lot of times we'll have, okay, here's a radiogram form, you put it in front of somebody and they just start filling it out. That is a terrible way to go about messaging. The form exists for the purpose of putting structure onto a piece of paper. It's there to help somebody get the information organized into the right format. And the format is how we organize information for presentation or for exchange of information. So looking at these steps, I mentioned 3. I want to break the second step, relay, down into 2 sub-steps. One is relay, the act of sending. One is relay, the act of receiving. So when we talk about origination, that's what happens in the very first place. That is where you take a message and you prepare it for relay to someone else. You have to know where it's going. You have to know from whom the message has come. You need to know what the text of the message is. And then you as a radio operator need to understand things like your preamble, and if you need to put any other special stuff like op notes in place. Once origination has taken place, that's not any radio kind of stuff. Now the message can be relayed, it can be sent. And that's where we get into things like voice procedure or CW or whatever we're using. So there has to be obviously a complementary station there for the relay process, somebody who's able to receive it. And from there, it will get to the point of delivery. Delivery, again, not radio stuff. Delivery is taking that from the format that has been used for transmission and turning it into something that is no longer a radio message. It is now a message that is going to make sense to the person who is receiving it, not to somebody who's necessarily doing transmission. Delivery is very, very poorly done in my experience. People will call somebody up on the phone to do delivery and they want to start using voice procedure, number 2714 routine. And this is like, spam, I'm hanging up. And so the message never gets through because we haven't delivered well. So the fact of the matter is that if we understand what these things are and we actually look at what training material there is, then we're able to do a good job with this stuff. The MPG is the methods, practices, guidelines for NTS, includes all of the stuff that we need to understand how these things work. So we understand how to originate something. We know how to fill things out. We know how to go through the process of relaying things. We know how to account for the stuff so that we know which station received the thing from us, at what time they received it from us. We're able to keep track of the status of a message. Is it still on our station? Do we have the responsibility for moving it? Or have we already taken care of it? Now it's in somebody else's hands. Those are all things that we already know how to handle if we are reading the documentation that's available to us, if we're following the training that is available to us. So when we get into this business of delivery, in some cases, it's fine for delivery to come in some kind of a form that is not attached to some particular presentation format, where the message gets through here, thanks for the coffee, that kind of thing. You don't need that to be on a particular form. The message is understood. You know where it's come from. You know where it's going to. Everything needed for the purpose of that communication is covered. But when we are talking about how we are going to make this work in the EOC environment, or where we have an ICS environment or NIMS, and somebody is very particular about, I've created an ICS 213 as an example, and I need for that other person to get an ICS 213, well, what do? Well, the fact of the matter is we've had a solution for this for decades before there was a thing called an ICS 213. The exact process that we just went through is still available to us. This is why it's helpful for us to understand what resources are available, because when somebody presents us with this ICS 213 general message, that's okay. We can see what this is. It's a form. It is some a structure that's imposed onto a piece of paper, whether physical or virtually, that's going to put things in particular places that will help somebody to make sure all the right information is there, as well as for somebody receiving it to understand what they're looking at. And they don't have to do a lot of reading to see. If I need to see where this thing is going to, I know that I can look at box 2 for my general message form. I don't have to go read the whole thing and try and figure out where's it going to go. So when we're talking about this 213, it has a purpose. The radiogram has a purpose. The purpose of the radiogram is going to support things that are unique to radio messaging. Things like accountability, the stuff that we talked about, being able to track which station received from you, to which station you received from, when you got it, and so on. Things like quality of service, being able to specify precedence, handling instructions that says this thing has to be delivered within 2 hours. Those are things that do not exist in the 213. There's nothing in here about precedence. So how am I going to deal with the stack of 213s and get all those transmitted the right way if I've got one of these that has information that will be no good in an hour from now, but it's number 17 in my transmit queue? I'm not doing anybody any favors by sending them stale information. On the other hand, if I've got radiograms and we have correctly used precedence, we're going to be able to put the messages in the right order for transmission. We're going to be able to put them on the correct circuits to make sure that they have the kind of service quality necessary for the purpose of making that information get where it needs to go when it needs to be there. So how can we put these two things together? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. When we're talking about something, the ICS 213, we got this message, we can take this and we can put it inside of a radiogram. It is encapsulating this ICS 213 in a form for transmission over a circuit. So here's an ICS 213 as an example. We have a place where it's going. It's going to be going to this RU Thayer, the area commander. How are we going to get it there? Well, it's written in the ICS 213. There may or may not be additional information there. The ICS 205, signal operating instructions, something else somewhere might tell us where that person physically is, or there might be a communications plan that tells us what circuit we have to use, how we're supposed to get the message there. In any case, it's either spelled out there or we have some additional documentation to help us get it routed to the right place. Okay, so fair enough. We pick up whatever that information is, and now we just put that into the appropriate place of the radiogram. We know because of our incident action plan, for example, that Mr. Thayer is at the Ohio EMA station W8SGT. And so we can take that information, we can add it so that when we have the radio message, we are directing it to Ohio EMA W8SGT RU Thayer Incident Commander. Moving on to where does it come from? I am here, the incident commander. Okay, the same thing is going to be true there. Do we have enough information for a return message? That again should be something that comes up from the IAP or something else, or the information is provided in here. Again, that goes in the corresponding section of the radiogram. So down in this case, it would go into the signature. same information. So what we are going to do then is when we take a look at all the other stuff that has to go in there, the radiogram might not have a separate place for everything that the ICS 213 has. For example, subject, incident name. Those are all things that might not exist or in a radiogram, but do exist in another document. That's okay. We can just put that in the text. The incident name, we can spell that out. The subject, we can spell that out. And remember, the radiogram, the amateur radiogram has something called an op note. This is a note to the operator that attaches to, it becomes a part of the radio message. But that's not for somebody receiving it. Mr. Thayer is not going to get this op note because Mr. Thayer is not the operator. The radio operator who is going to make that delivery to Mr. Thayer is the one who needs to see that op note. That op note says deliver as ICS 213. That is an instruction to that delivering station. So now what happens is we can go into the message, we get the text, put all the stuff in there. We won't go into all the rules for how to make that work so that it can go over voice and CW circuits and all that kind of stuff. But we finally wind up with a radio message that looks like this. Some people raise the question, oh, this is a limited to 25 words. That's not useful for anything. All right, well, 25 word limit is not really a limit. That is something that is put in there as a recommendation. If you look at the MPG, it's a recommendation for the purpose of regular daily training kinds of messages, the birthday greetings and that kind of stuff. If an incident commander needs to get something to the area commander and it has to go through a system of relay, you can be sure that we can get way more than 25 words into one of these things. So we need not to be hung up on the number of rules that exist in the printed form. It is the format that matters. The form just helps us to put things in the right format for transmission. All right, so we've got all that stuff in there. Now we do some more radio stuff about this. Okay, how do we fill out the rest of the preamble so that we have all of the right stuff in there so it will be ready for transmission? Once that has taken place, the relay happens. We use the voice procedure, the CW procedure, whatever we're doing, and the message is going to be received by some other station. And of course, we have our accounting so that we keep track of which station received it from us and what date and time that was, so that we have the ability to report, yes, we handled this message. And if somebody needs to go chase that down, we have the ability to do so. Same thing on the other side. When they're receiving the message, they're going to be recording they got the message from our station, date and time, and so on. At this point, we now have both the sending station and the receiving station have the same radiogram. It should be word for word, letter for letter, identical. All right, so when we get to the point of delivery, we're talking about something that is going to Mr. Thayer, the area commander. The area commander does not want a radiogram. We never throw messages at somebody. We have to put it into the form that makes sense to them. Again, we go back over our op note. Our op note is telling that delivering station to deliver this as an ICS 213. So where in the process of origination, we encapsulated the message, we put it inside of this transmission format, the radiogram. For the purpose of delivery, we are now decapsulating. We are taking out of the radio message format and putting it into the specified format, the ICS 213. So what we wind up with is something like this. Somebody who understands, the radio operator who understands what an ICS 213 is, who has a radiogram in there that says deliver as an ICS 213, is able to extract all of the right stuff, put it into the ICS 213, and now Mr. Thayer has the message in the format of the ICS 213 as intended by I am here, the incident commander. These people handling this incident they don't need to know, and they might not know at all, that this was in fact handled by radio. They might not know that somebody sent this thing by voice relay, somebody else sent it by CW. The only thing that they see is the message. It might look a little bit different in terms of capitalization and that kind of stuff. And that's just because as a matter of practice, we're going to put these things in all caps because CW doesn't distinguish between capital C and lowercase, and neither do we distinguish when we're voicing a message. So we just deliver it in this format. We may also, depending on what the needs of the agency are and how the local procedure is for keeping track of these things, we might add a preamble and accounting information. We might record that, the part that's on that radiogram, that is the metadata, if you will, about the message. We might put that on the ICS 2 and 3 as well, so we can see when did this thing come in, from which station did it originate, and so on, all that kind of stuff. That can be put in here. It goes outside of those boxes. We can't put that into box 7 because it's not part of the message. Nevertheless, if it's helpful to see it, we can put it up there just outside of the boxes, outside of what somebody sees as the ICS 2 and 3. And then we have a single record that shows this is the message, and it includes the preamble, it includes the accounting, so that somebody can see where did the message come from, how did it get to us. So that is a straightforward mechanism for us to be able to use things that already exist to be able to solve a problem that we didn't realize we were actually dealing with. So I've kind of blown through a bunch of this, but that's because I've got a bunch of other training videos and all kinds of stuff that we go into the details of the mechanism. I want to focus on the concept of what we're dealing with. Now, the question arises at this point. Once we say, okay, there's a way to do all of this, where do we go from here? What do we do with it? The fact of the matter is that many of our NTS operators are simply trained for relay. They don't do origination in any meaningful way. They don't do delivery in any meaningful way. Many of our NTS operators don't even know how to spell ICS, much less understand how it relates to anything in the world of emergency management. At the same time, we have many who are the Aries operators who are used to going out and setting up a station or setting up in an EOC, being the face to the to the communications unit leader, for example, and they don't know anything about the traffic system. So where we go from here, in my view, is once we understand the concept, is to create an exercise. And when we create that exercise, do so in a way that is not going to be so singular focused. Don't have an Aries exercise or an NTS exercise. You want to force them to have to work with one another. So if you have an active CERT organization locally, for example, that would present an opportunity where you can have some kind of an exercise. We did this in Franklin County, Ohio, where we would do something like have our CERT, they were training for light search and rescue operations. So we had things like Boy Scouts that would play the roles of victims. We had a moulage team that would put some, really gnarly looking injuries on them with all the makeup and all that kind of stuff. And Boy Scouts love that, by the way. And they play fantastic victims. We've had stuff like we'll be in the building, we'll turn all the lights off in there and that sort of stuff. We've got the Boy Scouts all moulaged up and everything. We've got the fire simulator at the end of a hallway, and then we would have a CERT go in to see if they've got victims in this building that they need to clear out of there. So it's training for CERT. They've got this thing that they're working on, but it creates also a scenario where we've got a disaster situation. For the purpose of the exercise, we introduce some artificialities in terms of time compression and so on. But we do things like this scenario calls for there to be a loss of communication. They just don't have the ability. The cell phones are not working. The stuff is just not, they are the help. and there isn't any communication for the moment. So the Aries guys get to go out there and set up their go kits and that kind of thing. We also have the victims that are coming out of there, and they may need to be transported or whatever. In many cases where we're talking about the tactical, like we're calling for an ambulance, we're calling for transport, that kind of stuff, that's being done tactically. There's no messaging that's happening in terms of somebody originating a message, a 213 or whatever. They are creating those kinds of messages for other types of things that are going on. So it's not just one kind of messaging activity. We'll also do stuff like have our Boy Scouts would have each one of them would have a little card that would say what their name is. It would say what kinds of injuries they have. It would say the names of some of their, somebody that they want to get a message to. And then that person playing the role of a victim would talk to one of our traffic operators, and the traffic operator would take a message from that person and have to originate a message. And so what they would wind up with is, like one of these guys where somebody at the site is talking to somebody playing the role of a victim, and they fill, one of these things out. So now we have the Aries people who have set up their mobile stations are in the business of originating. They are communicating on behalf of somebody there who has a communication need. So they're able to take one of these things, they're able to introduce it to a traffic net, because those operators are not the ones who are typically going into the field, setting up a station and so on. They are the relay stations. So when the Aries operator gets out there, talks to the victim, originates one of these, and correctly voice relays it on the traffic net, the traffic system can now pick it up from there. That net will have liaison to other nets and so on. And that's how those messages are able to move anywhere that they need to go around the country or into some other countries, depending on what the situation is with the third party agreements internationally. These exercises don't need to be complicated. You can have the whole thing run over the course of an hour or two. Here's an example of one of these little cards I've got in here. You might not be able to read that, but it says, okay, here's who you are. This is your name. And this is what your situation is. You cannot move your legs. You cannot feel, you cannot feel pain in your legs. Here's what's going on, and here's a phone number and a person to get a message to. And so we've got the phone number set up so that the person who's answering the phone knows, that these messages are coming in. It's part of an exercise and all that kind of stuff. But it's this ability to take one of these, that actor talking to the traffic or to the Aries operator, who can create one of these, who then relays it, and it goes through this process where then on the receiving side, we can compare how did we do in terms of getting this communication to take place. So whether you're doing this for the purpose of simulating communication on behalf of a victim, or whether you're doing this for the purpose of communicating on behalf of an agency, in which case you can introduce things like requirements to use an ICS 213, for example. You have the ability to get people working with one another in their respective roles, complementing one another to be part of a system of viable emergency communication. So the ICS 213, there's nothing special about it. The traffic system is already there in place. It knows how to relay messages. And it's really just a matter of training for origination, that is how to get something into the form of a radio message for transmission, and then delivery, which includes the process of getting the message out of that radio relay format and into something that makes sense for the purpose of delivery, something that makes sense to the person who's going to be receiving it, so that they don't need to have an explanation about what it is that they're looking at before they can even see what they really care about. So the pieces fit together. They fit together very well, but it does require some practice. for them to be able to work. And this is something that surprises a lot of people, especially if they've come up in one program or the other and have kind of a siloed view. So, that's my take on how to use the traffic system for the purpose of the 213. It's really just a matter of understanding how the pieces fit together. I've got videos on my channel, again, that walk through the mechanics for how to do all this stuff, specifically with the ICS 213. I expect that we're going to see a lot more of these kinds of things going on, as we've got some of these Mars exercises, for example, that are coming up. We hear about the relay of ICS 213 on amateur circuits. I have a video that I have not made yet, but I happened to be on vacation and I caught an exercise, a statewide exercise that was on the air. And some of these Aries operators were trying to relay 213 without using any of the procedure for how we relay messages. Things like our voice procedure, that they just weren't following it at all. Whether they actually put them into radiograms or not, they should be able to understand pro word like I spell, or how to introduce figures, or how to introduce initials. They were using none of that. The relay was basically just a conversation between two operators. It was a short message. It took forever, and it was lossy. The message that was received was not an exact duplicate of what was sent. It was terrible. And this is what's going on in a statewide exercise. It's not the operator's fault, because for the most part, we've done a terrible job of training people for this. So hopefully the takeaway here is that we have these things, the resources are already there. It's helpful for us to break out of our silos, to create exercises that don't have to be big, but they should be broad, so that we cause all of these components to work together, and then find the kinks for how they might interface with one another better, so we can develop improved procedures and overall make amateur radio a more viable service for emergency communication. And with that, I'll open up for questions. Woo!
Put your questions in chat or raise your hands.
Oh, here, hey, I see there's a chat. Okay. Remember, every resource order message gets copied to finance without fail. Communit doesn't do it, it won't get done. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for that. So the takeaway here is that the structures that exist for managing information within the incident, they have their own flows for records and how all of those things are meant to be done. And that's part of the reason why they want them to be in particular forms, because there are people whose job is to compile all of this. They need to have things in a very readily recognizable form, because they're going to route those things internally, and they're going to store those documents in particular ways. So a lot of what we're doing when we are focused on our emergency communication by radio role, we have a very specific, a very narrow focus. And so it's important for us to do that job very well, so that we can make sure that other people have the ability to use, to do their jobs. All right, we've got some raised hands as well. And
yeah, Matthew, can I talk in to lower your screen, please?
Say again.
Lower your desktop.
Oh, yeah. Well, it'll be one of these buttons. We'll see how. Oh, how about, hey, how about this one?
How about that? Okay, Victor, you got your hand up. You want to take it away?
Thank you very much. Victor from Everett, Washington. Couple questions I have in building a relay, or building the training. I'm actually looking at two different scenarios. One that's going to be more of a statewide effort. And I think I will have some professionals helping me on this. But the other one is more of a local thing. We usually have about 10 operators that participate. how many relays do we really need to do in a training? And because it's local, I don't want, personally, the way I'm thinking it, I don't want everybody on the same frequency. So we're limited in what frequencies we can use anyway. But how do we break that up and spread it out so that operator 4 is not hearing the message from operator 1, 2, and 3 and already knows what it is because he's written it down by the time it's gotten into his hands? Thank you.
Yeah, so the way that we run a lot of those exercises and the basically emergency mode operation is very often different from what we have in sort of our daily operation. So most of the traffic nets that we hear, they tend to keep everybody on one frequency, and they might have a side frequency. So the nets tend to take a rather long time. And part of the rationale for that is because they want people to hear the process of relaying and as a training matter. Now, in the scenario you're describing, that is actually unhelpful because you want them to have to deal with something individually. So that scenario actually fits what makes sense for more of a disaster, like a real disaster scenario, which is the goal is to have the messages move as quickly as possible. So we have a statewide net that we built up for our Black Swan exercise. And the way that we run that, it tends to be where we have control is taking place on one channel, and then we will have message relay. If it's a station to station relay or getting something to a liaison, we'll push those off to side channels very quickly. So the idea then is if I've got, station Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, and then I've got also the net control station Zulu. If Alpha has a message to transmit, and Charlie has a message to transmit, and Bravo is a eligible recipient of Alpha, and Delta is an eligible recipient for Charlie, then we'll have Alpha and Bravo change frequency, go to the whatever side channel 2, exchange the traffic. The same thing with Charlie and Delta, move them over to channel 3. And so even if that means the control channel is quiet and it's just net control making the call for stations who are returning, stations who are reporting into the net, and so on, that's how we tend to operate when we need to move traffic quickly and efficiently. And so that's a good, I think, model for the kind of training that you're talking about. That prevents, obviously, people from being able to hear what's going on. So if you've got the same kind of message, for example, or a situation report, or if you want to have one message, you're simulating multiple hops, side channels, as much as you can use them, that will help you with that problem. Did that answer?
Yes, I think it does. Thank you.
All right, Barry, what we got in chat?
We are good in chat.
Any comments in chat?
Nothing, just a couple of minor things. Thank yous to Matthew and stuff about the 213RR and getting the stuff copied to finance.
Okay, sounds good. Well, gee, Matthew, you did a real good job here. We're not being bombarded by questions, so
yeah. There is actually there's a detail in the chat that's probably worth addressing on. There's a question of the digital form. There is a digital radiogram as well as a digital ICS that exists in FL Digi. I'm sorry, FL Message. So FL Message will have something, if you want to use a form on screen where you're typing all the stuff, FL Message does give you the ability to do that. I've actually got a video that talks about how to use FL Message to originate something like that. When you start doing encapsulation and that kind of stuff, things can get a little complicated if you're working with the on-screen forms. As a general rule, the way that forms are handled right now, and the direction that a lot of them are taking is, in my view, wrong. Keep in mind, again, my background, the way that I'm approaching this is I'm coming at this from the perspective of I did a lot of work for a lot of years building up the internet and building up ways for us to get computers to talk to one another. So how we could get, some kind of a giant IBM system, EBCDIC based, to be able to exchange email with somebody's Mac. I mean, those are the kinds of problems that we had to deal with. And so in doing so, we had to standardize on format, and we had to break format from presentation. With WinLink, there's a lot of very tight integration between the form and the fact that it's in the WinLink system. It's difficult to take a WinLink form and to pull it out and to put it in for transmission with NBEMS, for example. It can be done. You have to understand what the pieces are and how to make them fit together, but it's difficult. FL Message has similar issues. It's not as bad because it's not as tightly wound into another system. But those are problems that we have. And so the more that we try to have a form on the screen where we just fill out the right boxes, the more that we actually wind up limiting ourselves. And so it's not that it's a bad thing. It's a trade-off. There's nothing that's going to be all good or all bad. So as you're looking for those kinds of things, be aware that those are the trade-offs that you're making, and don't be too hasty to attach yourself to a particular means of input or a particular means of presentation.
Okay. Are there any more questions, comments?
Dan, I just wanted to thank Matthew for agreeing to do this, and I appreciate the communication, the support, the interaction that we've had between the two of us. Those messages have been very helpful to me, and that to mention that our district, the Cape Cod and the Islands Aries district, is working on training on using Matthew's process. That's we're going to see how that works out. The next step is to do an exercise, as you said.
All right.
Oh, there is a question in chat. Is there a difference between tactical voice messages and formal written message? The answer is yes. I'll give a very short answer about the difference. A tactical voice message, as a general rule, is where you are getting information from one place to the other. It's direct. It's not by relay. And it is also, it's something that is safe to gist. You don't have to get exactly the same wording. That you have to get the concept has to be the same. They also tend to be very short. The convoy has arrived. Time 1045. That would be an example of something that is a tactical message. It might be written down, but it's a tactical message. It's very, very short. It's one point to the other. A formal written message, that's sometimes called record traffic. Record traffic is something where we're expecting that is going to be a record of some sort. It's going to go into the incident, the compilation of all. There was some discussion in the chat about, how these things get routed internally, and these get compiled into this is how this incident was handled. Those kinds of messages. Those are what go into the 213 or the other sorts of record traffic. It's a standalone message. Those tactical messages are the kinds of things that you'll have in your radio log or in your activity log, where you're just writing down some very specific, short, typically one-liner kind of thing. That's the best way I can think of to describe the difference.
Well, thank you. Hopefully that cleared a few things up.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? I don't see any hands up. Nothing's in chat. I'll double check with Barry. We got anything, Barry?
We are good in chat.
All righty, well, let's call it a night. And Matthew, I thank you very, very much. That was a good presentation. Well done. Thank you for your time and effort in doing it. Hope to have you back again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I had a great time. I'm always happy to be here.
We're always happy to have you. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to say 73s, everyone, and probably see you, if not beforehand, next week. 73s.
Good night, all. Thank you for coming.
Night all.